Hello, and welcome to the Personality Junkie Podcast. I'm AJ Drenth.
And I'm Elaine Shallock. Being as this is our very first podcast, AJ and I spent a lot of time deliberating over what we should talk about today, because ultimately whatever we decide to talk about here sets the stage and a foundation for future podcasts, but it also gives you guys an opportunity to know what it is that differentiates us from other personality blogs and websites and podcasts out there. And so after discussing it at length, we ultimately landed on the topic of understanding the functions as well as the functional stack.
So as you are probably already aware, the Myers-Briggs is comprised of 4 pairs of dichotomous opposites, and these include the introversion or extraversion preference, the sensing or intuition preference, the thinking or feeling preference, and the judging or perceiving preference. So when we take the Myers-Briggs or related personality test, our type is made up of one of each of those 4 pairs of preferences. And the reason that it is important to go beyond the preferences and start looking at the functions in the functional stack is because the preferences really only describe our type on a fairly superficial level. They really don't give us much information, however, about how we can grow and develop within our type, as well as the types of dynamics that occur within our type as far as having different elements that each type is made up of. And so sometimes those elements are in conflict with each other, sometimes they're in harmony with each other, but the preferences really don't allow for an easy discussion of those types of dynamics.
Right. Most people are not necessarily aware that whatever Myers-Briggs type you are, be it like an ISFJ, ENFP, whatever type, that's really shorthand for a series of functions that comprise the functional stack. And so knowing just the preferences, again, it's like a shorthand equation for a longer, more in-depth understanding of how you work and how you grow.
So let's say you took the personality test and you came out INFJ. Another thing that the functions do is they provide more information about the type of, say, intuition that an INFJ has compared to another type like an ENFP. So we know from Jung's work that there are 2 types of intuition. There's introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. And that the INFJ uses the introverted type and the ENFP, for instance, uses the extroverted type.
Right. So it might be worth, before we get too far into that, it might be worth actually defining what a function is, so we can understand and unpackage that a little bit easier. So a function is essentially one of either the sensing or intuition or the thinking or feeling preferences combined with a directionality of either introversion or extroversion. So for example, it's intuition, as AJ was saying, it's intuition paired with an extroverted direction to make extroverted intuition, or intuition paired with the introverted direction to make introverted intuition.
And it's not that there isn't some commonality, some shared qualities between the 2 types of intuition or the 2 types of sensing, for instance. There is some level of similarity there, but there are also some important differences that emerge when intuition is used in an extroverted fashion versus when it's used in an introverted fashion.
I would note that understanding those differences between the direction of the preference, i.e. the function, is incredibly beneficial for people who are having a difficult time hammering down their exact type. We see this a lot with like INFPs and INFJs. One letter of difference, it sounds like, just the P and J difference. However, when you look at the actual functions, you realize that they have no functions in common, that INFPs actually use extroverted intuition and INFJs use introverted intuition.
I think that's a great point that you make. When I'm encountering someone for the first time and I'm trying to figure out their personality type, one of the techniques that I use is I'm looking for what their extroverted functions are. Each personality type has, we can get into this later, but has 2 introverted functions and 2 extroverted functions that they use. Now, because the introverted functions are directed inwardly, those are harder to detect from the outside, but the extroverted functions are more available, more evident when we interact with someone. And so I'm often trying to figure out what functions are they extroverting, what functions is this individual showing me, and that gives me important clues about their personality type. And I think that's another reason why the functions vis-a-vis the preferences are important, because the functions have that directionality component. So I can see, for instance, whether feeling is being extroverted or intuition is being extroverted or thinking is being extroverted.
Okay, so before we lose listeners who might be confused as to why, if they're an introvert, say, they have a function in an extroverted attitude, I think it probably bears going ahead and getting into what we call the functional stack. So AJ, why don't you explain that?
So Jung named his personality types after the dominant function. So nowadays we use the term INTP to describe a type that has introverted thinking as the dominant function, or ISTP. Both of those types have introverted thinking as the dominant function. But when Jung first developed his work, he would just call both of those types the introverted thinking type. What Jung also realized was that functions are kind of like tools. So the introverted thinking type, for instance, to go back to that example, would have a difficult time operating in an external environment or an extroverted environment if he or she was only using introverted thinking. And so Jung realized that though a type is characterized by a primary function or a dominant function, that can't be the only thing or the only function that the type is using. There must also be additional functions that step in to play other roles that are necessary for that individual to thrive or function optimally in a given circumstance. And so that's why we must also think about the other functions that are in what we call the functional stack. So we've already talked about the dominant function, and following that are the auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior functions, respectively. Those 4 functions comprise the functional stack for each personality type.
Right, so as AJ alluded to, each attitude is complemented or contrasted, depending on how you see that, with an opposing attitude. So if you're an introverted type and you your dominant function is, say, introverted thinking, that is then complemented with the auxiliary function in an extroverted direction of some kind. So it would be introverted thinking combined with either extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition. And so that development of the introverted and then the extroverted attitude creates balance, and as AJ already said, an ability to function more optimally between the inner and the outer world. And the same is true for the extroverted types. They, although their dominant function would be a function that has an extroverted direction, so if you're an ENTP, your dominant function would be ENE, extroverted intuition, that would then be complemented by an auxiliary function in an introverted direction. In the case of the ENTP, it would be introverted thinking. And so there is a constant interplay between the introverted and extroverted, or extroverted and introverted attitudes in the functional stack. And so when people say, well, I feel like I'm, mostly introverted or sometimes introverted, but I'm also sometimes extroverted, that's because we all have the ability to oscillate and alternate between an introverted and an extroverted function. It's just the degree to which we do that, and what we do most, or what we lean on the most, and maybe what is used least. And so when people are given their shorthand Myers-Briggs type, like INTP, and they say, well, I'm an introvert, but I still see so many ways in which I'm an extrovert. Is it possible that I'm both an I and an E, an introvert and an extrovert? That a lot of that can be explained again by the fact that we all have the ability to alternate between introversion and extroversion. It's just about the degree to which we do that.
Right. In similar fashion, people aren't always sure whether they're a thinker or feeler, or a sensor or an intuitive. And we hear that I have some of both. I have sensing elements, and I have parts of me that are intuitive. And so how do I reconcile that and know my type? Well, the explanation for that is kind of similar, in that every personality type has a sensing function, an intuition function, a thinking function, and a feeling function. And so it comes as really no surprise that you have some of these elements in you, because your type does include those things. So whether you're a thinker or a feeler, it simply depends on whether your thinking function is privileged in your functional stack, or is higher in your functional stack than your feeling function. So as an ENTJ, for instance, the dominant function is thinking. It's extroverted thinking, to be more specific, and the inferior function is feeling. So in that type, it would usually be a little bit more clear that this person's a thinker, because there's such a disparity between the dominant and inferior functions there, although not always. And the same thing for the ENTJ's auxiliary function would be introverted intuition, and the tertiary function would be extroverted sensing. And so again, that type is considered an N type, an ENTJ, simply because their auxiliary introverted intuition comes before their tertiary extroverted sensing. So it's about the order in the functional stack. It's not that the ENTJ never uses sensing, or the INFJ never uses thinking, for instance. It's simply that the more dominant function comes before the less dominant function in the functional stack.
A great deal of the resistance to the acceptance of, the idea of typology, or the Myers-Briggs taxonomy, is that people struggle. They have an innate response, negative response, to the idea that they have to be all one something. I'm labeled an introvert, and that there's never an opportunity, or they don't see a way that they could also be an extrovert, or to grow. And so not understanding the functional stack prohibits people, I think, from maybe fully embracing Jung's typology in a way that they could or should, when they learn that, again, that we aren't one-sided. We aren't introverts with no ability to develop extroversion, or extroverts with no ability to use introversion or self-reflect. And if they knew that and understood that, again, that this Myers-Briggs type is just shorthand for a larger story, a more complete story, which provides an opportunity for use of all of the preferences, not just introversion or extroversion and so on. I think that more people would be willing to embrace Jung's typology, because they would realize that it's a little bit more complex than they initially got at first glance, thinking that they had to be boxed into just one particular preference. And in reality, this would be predicted actually by Jung himself, because he believed that if we developed just one aspect of our personality to the neglect of something else, that it led to a host of psychological issues, like neuroticism, among other things, that this one-sided development was not healthy and not natural. And so it only makes sense that people would be resistant to the idea that they're one-sided, that they're only introverts with no extroversion, or only extroverts with no introversion, because they fail to understand the functional stack.
So yeah, I agree. I think what you're essentially saying is that people can be inclined to throw out the baby with the bathwater when they feel like they're just being cast as a monolithic, one-sided person, because their psyche is telling them that they're more than that. There's more to be developed, and essentially that's what Jung's work was about. He did articulate that we all have a dominant function. We're all of a kind of a specific type, but that there's something larger than our personality type, and he referred to that as the self. And so, the process of growth and development is moving from something that's rather specific and a little bit one-sided, i.e. the dominant function, and expanding that into something larger that continues to grow and expand toward this more holistic and integrated self, this multi-dimensional self that also can be at the same time unified. Of course, the devil is always in the details, and getting from the dominant function to a well-oiled, well-integrated, well-developed self is not as easy as it might sound. It requires not only developing each of your type's 4 functions, but also finding a way to have those functions work in harmony together and sort of
to be in balance with each other, I think, because there's a way in which they operate, in their most ideal form, and then they can start to go haywire, and we can see an imbalance where we begin relying too heavily on our weaker functions to the neglect of maybe our dominant functions, or perhaps the other way around, but that can lead to this sense of feeling out of control and stressed out. Anxiety can set in, and that's usually when people, what we see is a lot of times that's when people turn to typology to try to understand maybe who they are, or where they're going in their lives, and maybe why they've run into some of these roadblocks that they have, and maybe how to navigate that.
Right, and that's another thing. I mean, a lot of people, as we've said, they want to know their personality type, and they get the 4-letter preferences, but what does that really tell you about being a healthier individual, or when you feel out of control, or you feel like you're stuck and you don't know where to go? There's not a lot of insight that is gained just from knowing those 4 preferences, and that's why knowing your 4 functions, understanding that of those 4 functions, some of them are stronger and are weaker than others, and that those functions also kind of have to live together in the same space. And if we can get our heads around that and start diving into that world, that's where we're going to be able to work out some of the nitty-gritty details about getting unstuck, or being able to find flow in our lives, being able to find better harmony with ourselves and with other people.
Right, that's where the real value is. And while it's interesting and fun to explore the specifics of what it is to be a thinker and what it is to be a feeler and how that manifests in daily life, that's all well and good to know. And obviously we include that information on the website in some of our type descriptions and so on. And so that's available to read and to know and to understand. But just knowing those descriptions, like you said, is really just a part of the story, and it doesn't necessarily give us anything in terms of self-growth and development, which is the bigger picture and the bigger story that we're trying to do on Personality Junkie, and that I think that hopefully you, our readers and listeners, come to us for.
Yeah, knowing your type is very important. Knowing those 4 letters is very important. I don't want to underestimate that at all. But it's just to say that those 4 letters are kind of the tip of the iceberg, because underneath that tip is this much larger world with these functions and their interactions. And if you'll come with us into that larger world, I think you'll, even though there's a lot of learning that's involved in kind of learning about the functions and, okay, which one is my tertiary function again, and all of that, ultimately you're going to be glad, I think, that you did that.
So while, in a way, actually, this is really the tip of the iceberg of just the underside of the tip of the iceberg, in that there is so much more that we will say and that can be said, specifics regarding the functions and how those specifically manifest. And we really haven't delved in at all into the consciousness of the dominant and auxiliary functions vis-a-vis the kind of unconscious nature of the weaker functions, the tertiary and auxiliary, or the tertiary and the inferior function. And so those are things that we will look to future podcasts to discuss with you. But this just gives you, our listeners, an idea of maybe that starting place if you don't know where to turn after you've discovered your basic MBTI type and want to know where to go next. We really encourage you to understand the functions.
And if I can jump in, in my book, My True Type, it's aimed at helping you, first of all, identify your type, but to do so within the context of both the preferences and the functions. And the book also provides like in-depth explanations of the functions and the preferences, so you can sort of see where you fit into the world of both of those things. And I think it can really help serve as an introduction to the things that we've been talking about in the podcast today.
Well, we hope that this has been somewhat informative. I know that there's a lot even in that package there, that 20-minute package to digest, but we appreciate you giving us your time and staying with us, and we are looking forward to providing you with even more information and more insight and analysis in our upcoming podcasts.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so in several ways. In addition to purchasing our books and personality tests, you can contribute through the support page on Personality Junkie. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution, you can do so through our Patreon page, which we link to in the footer of our website. Patreon supporters can enjoy a variety of benefits, such as access to unpublished material, complimentary copies of our upcoming books, as well as input on post and podcast topics. Your contributions make it possible for us to continue to provide quality posts and podcasts. Thank you for your support.